Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today we've got a one-off episode, though it is part of a series, our American election series. I'm going to be talking to Gary Gerstle for the last time before this year's election in November about where we are with the 2024 presidential race. A lot has happened since we last spoke. We don't know what's going to happen in November, but we are going to take a guess. Gary, the last time we spoke, not that long ago, but it is an age in this election year, was just after the Republican convention. So Joe Biden was still the candidate, though you and I think, agreed in our conversation he wouldn't be the candidate for long. Tim Walz, I don't think at that point was on anyone's radar. I wouldn't want to say hand on heart. I knew who he was if we'd had this conversation back then. Of course, he is now the vice presidential candidate alongside Kamala Harris. And last night, we're recording this the day after, last night was the one and only vice presidential debate. You watched it in real time, I have to confess. I had better things to do between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. The conventional wisdom, as far as I can gather it, and having watched some of it, is that it wasn't a great night for Tim Walz. The conventional wisdom is also that these vice presidential debates don't matter. I saw someone saying, if you can find me anyone who can remember anything about Tim Kaine's debate with Mike Pence in 2016, they'll get a medal. However, it's possible this one did matter. I don't know. What do you think? You saw it in real time. As you were watching it, did you have a feeling this might matter?
It might matter. I don't think it's going to matter that much. I think it might have mattered more if Walz had had a stronger breakout performance. Of the two candidates, he's the one who is much less known on the national stage. And I think if he had had a stellar debate, it might have reignited some momentum and energy for the Democrats, which I think has been lacking in the last couple of weeks. We'll get onto that later. Vance was the more polished debater, the one who's had more experience here, the one who I think landed more blows, especially in the first half of the debate where impressions tend to be formed. I think that Walz got better in the second half, but he seemed in some respects not fully ready for the occasion. Now, it was not disastrous, and I think he got Vance very well, landed a big blow on the question of January 6th and what happened then. And he prompted Vance to say that Trump had lost the election in 2020, and he could not say that. Vance did not say that Trump won the election, so I suppose that counts as a bit of progress. But the Democratic camp will make adverts about that on social media platforms, and that will be broadcast far and wide. I don't think it was a disastrous performance for Walz. I think where the vice presidential debate can make a difference is if a significant number of people watching the debate come to the conclusion that this man is not fit to be president of the United States should something happen to the president during his term of office. That dynamic was in place in 2008 with Sarah Palin, who was John McCain's running mate. And quite a lot of Republicans abandoned McCain during that year to vote for Obama. Not because they liked Obama more than McCain, but McCain, who was only 71 years old, was seen as frail and infirm, and turning the country over to Sarah Palin was seen as something that would likely eventuate in disaster. Nothing of that sort happened last night. Vance, interestingly, showed himself to be civil, respectful, courteous. He clearly had a strategy, and I think he pulled it off. And whether that will pull some independents back into his corner remains to be seen. But I think I was impressed with his ability to switch strategies. He is the more polished, effective politician at this point. But my general conclusion, is that it's not going to affect the race that much.
I suppose I had two thoughts about what I've seen of last night and what I've read about it. I mean, Vance clearly is the better debater, but Walz, I think, didn't have a great night, and there were one or two moments where he looked really flustered. But he was the weakness on the stage for the Democratic ticket. The weakness on the stage for the Republican ticket was Trump. So the questions that Vance found hardest to answer were questions about Trump, particularly about January the 6th. When Vance was sort of freewheeling for himself, he was fine. When he was pushed into a corner with his presidential candidate, it became more difficult for him. And therefore, that should be a huge weakness. People aren't electing a vice president, they're electing a president. So if in a vice presidential debate, one side, the weakness is the VP candidate, the other side, the weakness is the presidential candidate, that shouldn't be a win for the Republicans. We'll have to see. On the other hand, there was one line in it that completely astonished me that Walz said, and it was pre-cooked because he said it at the end in his summing up. I don't think anything about it was off the cuff, in which he was talking about the coalition that Harris has assembled. And he described it as a coalition that runs from Bernie Sanders to Dick Cheney to Taylor Swift. That's not an appealing coalition, I think, for many Americans. But also, it is a nothing coalition, right? There is nothing that connects those three people except a dislike or even a loathing of Donald Trump. That is the only thing those three people have in common. You're not going to build a policy platform out of the shared preferences of Bernie Sanders, Dick Cheney, and Taylor Swift. It's a nothing burger coalition. And something beats nothing in politics. I was amazed that that was how they wanted to present themselves. Not least because maybe Taylor Swift is very popular, though I suspect she's not as popular as people think among people who don't like her. The other two alienate many more people than they appeal to, right? The Bernie Sanders-Dick Cheney coalition is not winning the presidency anytime soon. And I would have thought that in the phase of the campaign where the Democratic ticket was really gaining energy and seemed to have the wind behind it, it was because it had got beyond the Donald Trump is the enemy of democracy and we must do whatever we can to defeat him. And they were offering an alternative. There was something there. There was something there with Harris. It was called joy, but there are other things going on too. But it's almost like they've shrunk back. The energy has dissipated, as you say, and it's shrunk back into that, look, we can appeal to all the people who don't like Donald Trump. That's not enough. And I think Vance quite effectively last night showed that wasn't enough because he made it quite a policy-heavy debate. And you can take your view about which side you're on this question. But there was a lot going on that they were talking about last night. And for that to be the closing pitch, that seemed to me to be, it's rare to say this, just a straight-out mistake.
Well, I think it reflects a kind of loss of momentum within the Democratic Party's campaign and a nervousness and an anxiety that what they hoped would be working out of the convention is not working quite the way they hoped it would. And so they are falling back on the breadth of an anti-Trump coalition as the pathway toward victory. And I agree with you that it didn't land well. You can tell this was cooked up in a room and someone thought it was clever and passed muster with a bunch of consultants and they gave it the green light, save this for the end. But I think it indicates a certain loss of energy and momentum that they had coming out of the convention. And we'll talk about the convention itself. Kamala Harris had a remarkable month. And what stands back of this is a remarkable month. You and I talked right after the Republican convention, and we talked a lot about Vance then, and we were certain that Biden wouldn't be long for this presidential campaign. But I think we expected a lot more disarray in the Democratic Party camp than actually happened. I know I myself was in favor of a mini primary to vet various people in which Harris would be one of the principal participants, but not the only one. And instead, that's not what happened. Biden gave his endorsement to Harris, and the speed with which the Democratic Party gathered around Harris, I thought was really quite remarkable, followed by an electrifying convention, which was as finely choreographed a convention that I can remember, all the more impressive for having been accomplished in no time with very little possibility of preparation. And Harris presented herself well, not just simply as the anti-Trump. And she had a plan, she had a project. She conveyed a different mood, a sense of possibility. And then that was followed by the debate against Trump in early September, where she absolutely clobbered him in that debate. That's why he won't debate her again, because he fears that he will be clobbered again. And what she accomplished during that month was to wipe out really all the gains that Trump had been enjoying over Biden and put herself in a position to not just compete seriously for this election, but perhaps to forge ahead. And that second step of forging ahead has not happened in the last few weeks. The dynamics of the election have changed. The contest is now extremely, extremely close. You see indications that in certain states, Harris is losing a bit of support, but her momentum seems to have stalled. And I think I interpret Walz's performance last night as a reflection of that stalling. And I think in the most interesting conversations that are going on within Democratic Party precincts this morning where these plans are made is how do we regain the momentum? Because I don't think there's going to be a lot of momentum coming out of last night's debate for the Democrats. Now, of course, there are not a lot of people in the U.S. whose vote is genuinely up for grabs. I mean, there are very small numbers of people. Most people have made up their minds about these two candidates, but those small numbers of people are going to be critical to determining the outcome of this election, which I expect is going to be extremely close, probably with as small a margin as in the last two presidential elections.
The people who have yet to make up their minds which way they vote is a tiny number. But as always with these elections, the question of whether people vote or not is a big one. And that's where momentum matters in a different way. Energy matters in a different way, a sense of a building, a growing momentum behind a candidate. Like you, when I look back to our previous conversation, the thing I'm most surprised by is the complete absence of, at least from this perspective, a price being paid by the Democratic Party for the way in which their candidate for president in 2024 was ultimately chosen. Because Kamala Harris was chosen in a backroom deal, in a stitch-up. That's effectively what it was. A very small number of people, presumably including Biden himself, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and others, arranged this. And my instincts tell me that that would be off-putting for lots of people, particularly in an age of a suspicion of political deals and political stitch-ups. And at least till now, it seemed like no price had been paid for that. There is no historical precedent for it, so we've got nothing to compare it to. Maybe people don't mind. Maybe the fact that she is the vice president means that there looks like a natural order of succession here. But I expected there to be some disquiet among voters, exploited by the Republican Party. They tried to exploit it, but it doesn't seem to have worked, about the way in which this was done, not least because, of course, the people who stitched it up were, until they stitched it up, or even while they were stitching it up, many of them also defending Joe Biden, past the point actually where his continuing candidacy was defensible. And all of that seemed to sort of wash away in the excitement of her initial candidacy in the convention, which I agree did a great job of just moving the story on, turning the page. There's a part of me that feels maybe it wasn't completely costless. And somewhere in the background, some of that is one of the reasons why Trump and the Trump-Vance ticket has been very hard to shake off, to the point where I checked just before we started recording, the betting odds as we stand now are 49.4, 49.4. So that is not just a virtual tie, that's a tie. Do you think maybe there is nonetheless some price being paid, particularly as the campaign unfolds? And, there is a sense that once you get past the excitement and the joy, there is a question about who Kamala Harris really is. What she is a career politician who has risen in a particular way with the aid of the support of the party. She's an establishment candidate. And the substance isn't quite there. And I'm reminded a little of her candidacy in 2020 when she stood to be the nominee against Joe Biden. And there was a lot of excitement. And once it started to fizzle, it fizzled quickly.
I think there is a cost, but I would frame it a bit differently than you have just framed it. I, too, was surprised by the remarkable unanimity and enthusiasm for Harris, given her past. And I think that reflects, on the one hand, the deep, deep antipathy felt toward Trump among some majorities of Americans. We're talking about majorities of Americans, and how depressed so many people were that the election was going to be lost because Biden no longer had the capability to either run or to be president. And then Harris seized the moment in a way that many of us thought she would not be able to do, and just impressed a lot of people with her presence, with her vision, with her demeanor. She looked ready for the job, and she confirmed that in the debate on September 10th. But what happened at the debate on September 10th, the most ridiculous claim that Trump made about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, stealing white people's cats and dogs and eating them, which was thoroughly debunked and ridiculed by everybody, allowed Trump to do what he does so well, which is to say so many outrageous things, consume so much air and media time, that even though this story was thoroughly debunked, it stayed front and center for the next few weeks, squeezing Harris's time to change the debate to other subjects. And here's where the cost comes in. She is not well enough known. Walz is not well enough known. She needed more opportunities like that debate in early September to show herself in combat, to show herself under pressure, to show that she has a vision. Walz, too, came off as needing more opportunities. He should have been tested before that debate last night. But one of the things that the Trump campaign has been able to do, and this is not really news, this has been one of his strategies from the beginning, which is to fill the airwaves with so much nutty stuff that people can't quite believe, that this becomes the obsession of the national news media while focusing attention on what is arguably the most important issue in this campaign, which is immigration and the failure to close the southern border. It is incredible to me that Trump has taken an issue on which he was thoroughly ridiculed at the time of the debate by almost everyone and make it into an issue that won't die, so that people are still talking about the cats and dogs of Springfield that Haitian immigrants are killing. And the effect of this has been to deny Harris the space, the airtime, the visibility she needs to make her case. So she is paying a price, but my framing is a little different from yours, is that I think if she had the opportunities, the national platforms, if there were more debates, she could regain her momentum. But I don't know how much this is a master plan of Trump, but we know him to be very, very shrewd about these matters, an incredibly effective campaigner and counterpuncher. And once again, he's taken what almost everyone regarded as an appallingly losing issue, and he has turned it to his advantage.
They were still talking about Springfield, Ohio last night. And there's a phrase, I don't know if it translated to US politics, but it's there in British politics and Australian politics. I think it's associated with the polling and strategy guru Linton Crosby, which is, if the conversation's not going your way, throw a dead cat on the table. And Trump, as a literal-minded kind of guy, is the only instance I can think of where the dead cat strategy involved a dead cat, or rather a series of dead cats and dogs, and it worked. It's extraordinary. I agree with you. It's amazing. It's a skill because it requires a kind of brazenness apart from anything else. Is the other way in which she's paying a price, and this may be the bigger issue, which is she isn't president. She's vice president. Joe Biden is still president. I don't know how it looks from the US. So from the outside, it may be we get a slightly warped view of it. But it feels like he's barely president in name, not name only, but not much more, at a time when everyone will be aware the world is in flames. I mean, not the world, but significant parts of the world, dangerous parts of the world are in flames. And it feels like there is a kind of license at work. It may be completely unfair, and the factors involved here may have little to do with the dying months of Biden's presidency, but nonetheless, there is certainly an impression that there is a license, a sort of permissiveness in international affairs created by a vacuum in Washington. And if so, if that impression, which is certainly present on the outside of the United States, is present at all on the inside of the United States, Harris will presumably pay a price for that.
I think that's right. I think it's not on people's minds in the U.S. consciously, but I think your phrase, the world is in flames or about to go up in flames, and there's no strong American president in charge right now. And I think we have to regard Biden's Middle East policy as verging on failure because of the escalation. It does feel like Israel is the tail wagging the dog here. By that, I mean the United States. I think Netanyahu wants to find a way to involve the U.S. in a war with Iran, and Hezbollah wants to find a way to involve Iran in a war with Israel. And I respect what Biden has tried to do in the Middle East, but there's a point at which the strategy fails and has to be acknowledged as failing. And my impression is that the circumstances are now spiraling out of his control. Ukraine did not come up last night, amazingly. I can't believe the moderators didn't bring up the Ukraine business. But there, too, I think a strategy that began well with Biden is not going well now with no clear solution. I think both Netanyahu and Putin want Trump in the White House because they think they will get much better deals from him than they will get from a Democratic administration. So they are going to try and play this out. And so there's deepening instability as we speak on the world stage, with opponents of America trying to use this electoral campaign to their advantage. It would be an extraordinarily difficult situation for any president to manage, but someone who's truly a lame duck president right now is not going to have any authority to enforce the will of the United States on these world events. And I think there is a creeping sense that quite a lot of Americans have that the world is no longer under America's control. And Vance had a line last night which said there were no issues of this magnitude under the Trump administration. And I think he got extraordinarily lucky. I shudder to think what would happen if he was presented with one of these crises and the kind of outcomes that would eventuate from this. But he got lucky. And so people look with nostalgia for a variety of reasons to the Trump years, also to a time when there was nothing terrible like COVID and no inflation to speak of. And there is tremendous nostalgia for that period that I think Vance successfully evoked last night. So I think the Democrats are coming into October against serious headwinds.
And when I think back to Trump's speech at the convention, in his inaugural address in 2017, he gave his famous American carnage speech, but his convention speech was a world carnage speech. So it had a long, extended section, which at the time, as so often with Trump, seemed a bit mad about the world being on the brink of World War III and on, and everything being chaos. And is it luck? Does he have some weird second sight? I don't think it's deep geopolitical analysis and a predictive capacity to anticipate the world 6 weeks down the line. But his line is always to talk everything down, to talk America down in its current state, to talk up danger and threat wherever he sees it, to describe every crisis as a catastrophe and every catastrophe as an apocalypse. And it didn't sit well, apart from the fact he had just survived an assassination attempt at the Republican convention, but it has a resonance now. And again, I don't want to put it down to his skills as a politician, because I think that's implausible, but it has something to do with his temperament as a politician. The world in October 2024 seems a better fit for him than the world in August.
Yes, I don't think he's blessed with clairvoyance about these matters, but he may have a sense that the world has been at an inflection point for some time in terms of the ending of a period of Pax Americana, a world in which America guarantees the peace of the world for a substantial part of the world, for better and for worse. And I respect enormously the efforts of Biden's team to try and control these international crises and push them in a positive direction. But currently, they are not working. And you can see the outlines of a grand settlement in the Middle East that may occur involving Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni Arab nations. But there's no way Netanyahu's got to give that gift to Biden. He's got to give that gift to Trump. And so it's not just intuition that's going on here, but it's maneuvering on the world stage by greater and lesser powers to order the world in ways that advantage them. And the terms have deteriorated for Biden and the Democrats over the last few weeks and represent a real threat to their chances going forward. I don't think these issues are foremost in the minds of Americans, but at a subconscious level, a sense of chaos in the world, of Biden not being present, not being able to do very much, and then that meeting the exaggerated claims of Trump that once he's president, everything in the Middle East and in Ukraine will be solved within 1 to 7 days. That is going to have a bite that it did not have a month ago.
Yeah, we shouldn't talk about this as though anything is done yet. It's a complete toss-up at the moment. I would say it still is a complete toss-up. It could still break both ways. I think what seems possible now in a way that didn't seem possible maybe 3 weeks ago is it could break significantly for Trump. It seemed, I would have said 3 weeks ago, if Trump was going to win, he would win very narrowly. I still think the likeliest thing, it's a very, very close election, but it could break for Trump, but it could still break for Harris. I think the full range of possibilities are there. Does this election remind you in a way that wouldn't have been the case if Biden had been the candidate of 2016? And in what ways do you think it's different? So it's like 2016 in that it's Trump against a female candidate. It's like 2016 in that it turns on a very small number of states, though they are different states this time. So some of the states that were in play in 2016, Ohio was one, I think it was thought to be. Florida was another, are now squarely in the Trump column. It looks like one of the decisive states is almost certainly going to be Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, there are 3, 4, 5 states on which this election turns as it did in 2016. There was a view that the Clinton campaign was complacent in 2016, and Hillary Clinton herself spent a strange amount of time, or her campaign did, kind of piling up votes in California and New York and spending money and time on those states and not focusing laser-like on the 5 states that mattered. And they're not going to make that mistake again. So presumably there has been serious learning from 2016. Is it a similar campaign? Do you think is it a similar election, or is it fundamentally different?
I think 2016 was a fundamental election in American life and American politics. It broke up a political order that had been dominant and introduced America to a very volatile period of politics in which forces on the right and on the left gained a kind of visibility and influence that they had not had, and all kinds of convulsions ensued, all kinds of hopeful possibilities and disastrous futures suddenly became possible and realizable. I think the 2024 election doesn't carry the same weight of breaking up an earlier era and pushing America into a new era. I think either if Harris or Trump wins, we will be able to trace what they are doing from the moment of breakup in 2016. If Trump wins, I think there's a good chance that democracy as it is known in America may cease to function. And if Harris wins, it will give her an opportunity to build on a quite extraordinary foundation of redirecting the economy that Biden has instituted over the course of his presidency, and for which he never has and still does not get any credit. So I think the election will be important in terms of determining the direction in which the country is moving, but I don't think will have the same explosive force and shock that 2016 had. So in that way, the frame is different. Harris knows she's in a dogfight in the way that Hillary Clinton never fully understood. And one thing that should be mentioned that is working in Harris's favor, and we don't know how to evaluate this because it doesn't appear anywhere in the polls, but she has a very sophisticated ground game going on, and she's using the vast amounts of money that she's raised to go local, tremendous numbers of volunteers knocking on doors. This is not going to depend simply on the sliver of independence, but on the quality of mobilization. And part of Trump's success, both in 2016 and increasing his vote in 2020, had to do with his ability to turn out voters in American politics that the pollsters had never seen before. And so they were not anticipating them, and hence the surprise of 2016. And we can say a surprise of 2020 in that the election turned out to be much closer than the pollsters in 2020 were anticipating. So there is a very serious ground game going on that may push the victory for Harris. And we have no easy way of evaluating how that is going, but that could also be decisive in terms of the election. And that is a very important lesson that the Democrats have learned from 2016, when Hillary's campaign organization, which was top heavy, almost too much money, arrogant, failed to accurately size up the situation, and they had her going to the wrong states at the wrong times. And, at one point, I think she was imagining a tremendous victory, an electoral college wipeout for Trump. And there was a kind of grandiosity that entered into her calculations. And the Democrats are under no illusions. They understand very well the kind of deep dogfight that they're engaged and involved in.
One of my memories of 2016 was the Trump campaign at the time seemed to have no get out the vote operation. It was a really scrappy campaign. It wasn't well organized. They didn't have a conventional ground game in any meaningful sense. And when, I can't remember who it was in Trump's team, was confronted with this fact, he said, no, we don't have a get out the vote campaign. We have a suppress the vote campaign. That's how we're going to win this thing. We're not going to win it by turning people out. We're going to win it by persuading people to stay at home and not vote for Hillary Clinton. And it worked. They really did target certain sections of the population, not believing that they could persuade these people to vote for Donald Trump, but they could persuade these people not to vote for Hillary Clinton. And that included young women, young black men, among others. And presumably that is not going to be as effective this time, partly because of who Harris is and her candidacy. There isn't the same history that they were able to exploit in Hillary Clinton's case going back to Bill Clinton's presidency in order to target certain voters. And so that to me feels different in that, the Democrats will win if people who aren't sure whether or not to vote.
And another related question is whether among some parts of the electorate that votes Republican, there's a cooling of enthusiasm for Trump. At some point, political fevers do break. And there are some indications that the Trump fever may be breaking among some people. And not in a dramatic fashion, not in the sense that huge swaths of the electorate that voted for Trump will no longer do that, but a recognition that the man has serious problems, that he may not be the best person to lead the United States of America, that their interests would not be served, that there's a crazy element to his leadership, concerns about his age and his ability to stay focused on the issues that matter, and even a modest dampening of enthusiasm among some sectors of the MAGA population could have enormous implications for the election. And this is also where the ground game and the local media strategies of the Harris campaign matter. I don't see any media, because I'm in a state, Massachusetts, where essentially my vote doesn't matter because Massachusetts will vote overwhelmingly blue for the Democrats. So there's no point in a political party putting their precious media dollars into this state. But in the contested states, this battle has been joined. And I think both sides are trying to elevate their own turnout and suppress the turnout of the other camp. And let me mention one other thing that may or may not turn out to matter in terms going forward. One of the surprising elements of last night's debate was the civility and courteousness that the two candidates showed each other. Walz is not a senator, but he's got a history in Congress. There's a familiarity there. There was a civility. By far the most civil debate of the entire Trump era that I can remember. And beyond the sense of civility and courteousness toward each other, there was some surprising common ground on issues that they shared. In other words, it's always the emphasis on polarization, two different Americas having no recognition of each other. But on matters of childcare, on matters of taking care of families, one can see the outlines of a compromise on immigration, the quite serious backtracking of Vance on the abortion question, which is we haven't talked about, but is going to be a huge factor in this election. One can't judge, especially given Vance's chameleon-like character, whether any of this was genuine, but there was an occasional glimpse of a politics beyond the culture war that emerged last night. And if we are to look for hopeful signs for America and the United States, then aspects of that culture war have to cool, and the different Americas, the different tribes of America have to find on some issues a common ground. They also agree on reshoring of manufacturing. They agree on tariffs. There has emerged willy-nilly in all this tumult the outlines of a different kind of economy and a different kind of politics. And if I take a hopeful sign from last night's debate, it was the sense that at some point in the future, the United States is not there now. One can begin to glimpse politics that transcends the bitter polarization, which is one of the defining characteristics of American society and has been for the last 20 years.
One more thing on last night before I want to ask you about a much wider question. I did find myself not watching in real time, but watching it afterwards, at the weakest moments in Walz's performance, wondering why did he get picked? What does it say about Harris or the people around her that they went for this guy? And one asks that question because it relates to the point about whether the lessons have really been learned. This election is going to turn on a small number of states. There are two or three. If you win them, you will win the White House. One of them is unquestionably Pennsylvania. And the thought was that she was possibly going to pick Josh Shapiro, who presumably would have made it more likely, as the governor of Pennsylvania, that Pennsylvania would be in the blue column. And maybe, I don't know what it was about Walz. He seemed to have a way of characterizing Trump and Vance as weird and a kind of folksy charm and an authenticity and integrity. And picking Shapiro would have looked very, very tactical at a time maybe when they were worried about appearing that everything was inside baseball politics, going for authenticity rather than transparent tactical advantage. I would have thought if you want to learn a lesson from 2016, just go for transparent tactical advantage wherever you can find it. And I got an email not long after that from someone whose views I respect and who knows a lot about American politics, who said, I paraphrase, she's going to lose Pennsylvania by 5,000 votes and we're going to be haunted by this for the rest of our lives.
Well, I was watching the debate last night. I found myself thinking, what about Josh Shapiro if he had been on that stage with Vance? And I found myself thinking that was the debate I wanted to hear. Now, as to why she chose Walz over Shapiro, and I think that was ultimately the choice, that's a closely guarded secret, and there's probably not one explanation for it. But let me just offer some elements that may have entered her thinking. We haven't talked about race at all, and I think one of Harris's achievements has been to appeal to the American people on a basis other than her own racial identity. And I consider that to be a real important breakthrough in American politics. And it reveals the distance we have traveled from the days of Obama, when everyone was talking about the fact that he was a black man aspiring to the presidency, where you don't hear hardly any talk about a black woman aspiring to the presidency.
Except occasionally when Trump doubts that is indeed the case.
Which has come up on a number of occasions. But we shouldn't discount the racial factor. And if she loses, that might be one of the elements, because one of the messages of the Obama presidency, yes, Americans elected a black man. Yes, he got many more white votes than expected. But the backlash against him as president was of a viciousness that I had not seen in my lifetime, which can only be understood as a kind of racist backlash and a conviction among many white Americans that at the end of the day, a black man should not be inhabiting the White House. And Trump, of course, used that theme to vault himself into prominence from 2012 to 2016. And we shouldn't think that all of that viciousness has gone away. You throw a Jewish candidate into the mix, a Black-Jewish alliance in America 2024, further complicated by the fact that the expectation at the time was that the Israel-Gaza war was going to divide the Democratic Party very, very deeply. In fact, that has not happened. That was a miscalculation. But the fear was you're not only bringing on a Jewish candidate to run alongside a black woman, which may be a bridge too far for too many Americans, but you would be bringing him on at a moment when the fears of division within the Democratic Party on religious lines would have hampered him severely and led to the kind of acrimony in the Democratic Party that the Democratic Party was desperately trying to avoid, because they figured if they generated acrimony, they had no time to recover from it. So I'm sure that was part of the discussions. And then there are other tidbits that I've heard that Shapiro was uncertain, that he was making certain demands on the vice president's portfolio, things that he wanted assurances that he would be able to do because he is extraordinarily ambitious and wants to become president himself that day. And the final element of it was Harris nervous that she would be outshone by him because he has quite extraordinary charisma to match hers. So I think all those went into those calculations at the time. And Walz had this extraordinary moment of catching the nation's attention, a high school teacher, folksy, being able to strip Vance of all the advantages he was presenting for himself as representing forgotten America. Walz also represented forgotten America. You can see the logic going into this. I think in retrospect, Walz, Minnesota is an important state, but it's not important like Michigan or Pennsylvania or New York or California or Texas. It's not a big state. He's had impressive achievements there, but you could see last night he was straining too much to present all his accomplishments in the state of Minnesota as making him worthy of this national choice. And I would say in that respect, his attempts to try too hard to do that revealed his own insecurity about whether he was ready for this. So I understand all the decision-making that went into choosing him. And at the moment, it may have been the best possible choice. But I did find myself thinking if Shapiro had been on that stage last night, he would have advanced the cause of Pennsylvania and the cause of the Democrats further than they achieved.
When you said that 2024 is not like 2016 in the sense that 2016 was not just a realignment election, but a kind of break, a historic break. And 2024 will be in one way or another an extension of that break, the move into the new era. Again, it's hard to know, but this is probably more predictable than the outcome of the presidential race, which is, as we stand, completely unpredictable. And that is, it looks pretty likely that the Senate will be Republican. Maybe, I think the current probabilities is it's thought the likeliest outcome is 51 or 52 Republican senators. Say Congress is Republican, even by narrow margins after this election. So then we have two possibilities. We have Trump as president with a Republican Congress, and we have Harris as president with a Republican Congress. And the two scenarios you laid out were Harris moving forward Biden's agenda and cementing some of his achievements and maybe going further in certain ways, Trump posing a threat to American democracy, but also presumably having more than last time a serious agenda in certain areas, including in economic policy. Foreign affairs is another matter, and that doesn't depend so much, though it does a bit, on Congress. But to what extent should we, whatever scenario eventuates here, should we be thinking about either the permission or the constraint, depending on who wins? And it may be with Trump, it's still a constraint, a Republican Congress, that outcome would have. Or is it premature even to say that? Should we think all of this is open and up for grabs?
I think the problem in the Senate is the Democrats are defending more vulnerable seats than the Republicans are this time. And one of the reasons for the insistence ultimately from Pelosi and others that Biden must go is that they were fearing the carnage in the down ticket Senate and congressional races and even in states. And the Harris campaign has been doing a tremendous amount of work in local areas of the country for turnout. And so I think we should not be presuming a Republican Congress. I think the betting odds are strong that the Senate is going to go Republican. I think the House of Representatives is more of a toss-up. And here, turnout, mobilization becomes really, really important. And something that is also uncertain, reference to what I was saying earlier about some of the Republicans acknowledging a nervousness about giving Trump another 4 years. It may be that some of them will begin to split their tickets, especially in cases where Trump has endorsed far-right, somewhat crazy nominees in the party. So I think we should not be presuming that Trump will take, if he wins, both houses of Congress. I think it's more likely that it will be split, but the reverse of what it is now, Senate under Republican control, Congress under Democratic control. If Trump has a Senate and House of Representatives to work with, there are two stories that could play out. One is to invoke a book that we haven't named yet, Project 2025, a 800-page book of everything Republicans are going to do this time that they failed to do last time, put together by the Heritage Foundation, which claims that they were given authorization to do this, if not by Trump himself, then by people very high up in the Trump administration. And this Project 2025 combines a vast project of deregulating the economy, shrinking the administrative state, with extraordinary intrusiveness into the lives of ordinary Americans, most prominently and extravagantly in terms of forcing every woman who's pregnant in America to sign up for a registry. That will be a national registry to prevent a woman traveling from one state to another to get an abortion, because the moment she turns up in another state, she will show up on that national registry and will be denied an abortion on pain of penalty for whatever doctor or hospital helps her. It's a very scary, far right-wing project. Democrats have been giving that a lot of publicity. It has scared Trump. He has disavowed it as something that he did not create and that he has no desire to accomplish. But it is the case that the Republicans feel that when they came into office in 2016, they did not expect to win. They did not have people experienced in government, that Trump had to rely on a lot of people who did not share his beliefs, and that they frustrated his ambitions. This time, they've got their people, they've got their legions, they're ready to go. It's got to be a radically different project that they're going to be putting in place. That's one scenario. And if that is, in fact, the case, that is something for the United States and the world to be very scared about, because ultimately it will be the financial markets themselves that will be at risk from this project. And the financial markets are global. The other scenario is that Trump cares no more for policy now than he did in 2016. And he had a Republican Congress from 2016 to 2018, and he got nothing done except one tax cut. He has never been really an ideologue. He has never shown an ability to follow things through. There's no indication that he's serious about a populist program that would shift wealth in America from Wall Street to Main Street. You know, the other scenario for a second term is that he just indulges in a kind of grift, enriching himself and his family and the adulation and power that goes with it. And America will continue to drift economically and as a society, lacking the kind of leadership it needs to embrace and triumph and do well in the 21st century. And which Trump is going to present himself to the American people if he wins and has a Congress to support him, I can't tell you. Either scenario scares me.
Do you think there's a possibility that the financial markets, as well as signaling their distress at some of what might happen under a 2025 project scenario, would also have a disciplining effect? As, say, I'm thinking of the Liz Truss, the very short-lived. I mean, it's a completely different system. You can't get rid of presidents in the way that Liz Truss came and went in a heartbeat. And it might not sober up Trump, although he pays a lot of attention to the state of the Dow Jones. But it might have a salutary effect on Congress, or do you think we're past that in American politics? The idea that real-world signals coming from markets waking politicians up out of their stupor or their fantasy or whatever it is.
We've had discussions about this before.
That's why I'm asking you again.
And I think Trump does care about the stock market, and he takes that as a very serious measure. But the Republican Party is populated by powerful people who want to continue to break things. And I think especially of the far-right Congress people in the House of Representatives, for whom the stock market is one more thing to break. In our earlier version of this discussion, I said the one thing that would discipline the Republican Party is if their reforms and their changes or their inaction or their irresponsibility and power become so extreme that they do blow up the global financial markets in a very serious way. Imagine Liz Truss on steroids. And even the Liz Truss event had global ramifications. Imagine if the United States engages in something of that sort. It's interesting to see how that unfolded in Britain, and it did end Truss-like fantasies in the Tory party. And I do think it may take something similar in the United States to end certain Republican far-right fantasies about what is possible in the world. So I would not put a financial crash as beyond the reach of Republican ideologues. And I would like to say that the Trump presidency won't come to that. But if he has not just the presidency, but both houses of Congress, it's something that America and the world has to worry about. And I would not want to go through that kind of financial crash for the sake of providing discipline to the Republican Party that thus far it has failed to achieve. It's interesting. Goldman Sachs published a big advert on social media platforms in the U.S. saying that the economy has been well managed by Biden and will be much more secure under Harris, and it will be under Trump. But significant numbers of Wall Streeters and Silicon Valley types have been congregating in the Trump camp. I think it reflects the seriousness of the Biden antitrust policy to break up some of these huge agglomerations of capital, especially in the IT sector. And it's a measure of their nervousness and anxiety about that program, that they're willing to put their fate in the hands of Trump, who I see as a very irresponsible economic leader. But it shows how a sector of finance capital and capitalist strength in America is very much in Trump's camp. And that has and continues to surprise me.
One last question. We're going to reconvene on the Thursday after the election, on the Tuesday. And I'd like to think that therefore we will know what happened. But of course we might not, because it might take time. And if you had to say what's likeliest to happen, I suppose still likeliest is that it'll be very, very, very close. Although there is a degree of closeness which then becomes improbable again. But say that scenario which I mentioned earlier unfolds. The Electoral College turns on Pennsylvania. You put it in one column, one candidate wins. You put it in another column, another candidate wins. And Pennsylvania is decided by 5,000 votes. That's, not only is that not beyond the realms of possibility, that could easily happen. Does the result hold? Let's have that conversation now and then have it again on the Thursday after the Tuesday.
Well, we won't be able to answer it the Thursday after. Will electoral procedures that exist be followed? That's the question I would pose. And if it's a very narrow victory for the Democrats, we have to expect that Trump is going to do everything he did last time to challenge the outcome and use every tool in his arsenal. Now, he won't have as many tools because he's not a sitting president. But the fate of the American Republic may hinge on the actions of people like Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, a Republican, lifelong Republican, who stood up to Trump's pressure on him to find 11,000 votes in Georgia, which Trump did not have, which would bring him the state of Georgia and reverse the outcome of the election. Since that moment, the Republicans have put a lot of energy into getting local officials allied with Trump onto election boards. And in the United States, elections are local, staffed by numerous election boards of ordinary individuals who may be skilled, may be well-meaning, may be unskilled, may be not well-meaning. And they have made a lot of progress in various places, and they are going to try and turn electoral procedure to a Trump advantage. Just to give you one example of this, the Board of Electors in Georgia, by a 3-2 margin, has just ruled that all the votes in Georgia have to be counted by hand. We're talking about like 5.5 million votes in Georgia that have to be counted by hand. The system doesn't have the capacity to count these quickly. The counting may take 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So you're talking about the following Thursday. It may be 3 Thursdays after that before we have the electoral results in Georgia. And in that period of indeterminacy, you can imagine what Trump is going to be doing. They're stealing votes. They're not counting them faithfully. This is a rigged, stolen election. So the possibilities so he doesn't have the same power and authority that he had when he was president, but he has a much better machine ready to throw spanners into the works to obstruct the electoral machinery from working. And if it stalls, that magnifies the opportunity for him to claim unjust results and to put his people, including his militias, into some kind of action mode. I shudder to think about the eventualities of that, and I'm not sure that all the democratic procedures that America has in place can hold, even though the Democrats are fully aware of these dangers, have legions of their own lawyers ready to fight in courts to keep the election honest. It's got to be its own furious and quite vicious struggle with an uncertain outcome.
And if it goes the other way, so in 2016, Hillary Clinton didn't want to concede, but Obama called her up on the night and said, you have to, you've lost, you've clearly lost. But if it goes the other way, 5,000 votes in Pennsylvania or wherever, and Trump is the winner, especially under the conditions you've described, Trump is the winner by 5,000 votes, say in a state where it's clear that the system has been somewhat stacked by people who favor his candidacy, does it hold the other way? I mean, I don't know what I mean by hold here. You can use grand words like legitimacy. They don't really mean much. Crisis of legitimacy. There's always talk of a crisis of legitimacy. There was in 2016. But Trump won that election clearly, as Biden won clearly in 2020. We haven't actually since 2000 had an election where it's not clear who won, and yet someone will have to be declared the winner.
I think if the victory is clear, the Democrats will accept it because they believe in democratic procedure in the ways that the Republicans don't right now. The question is if it's an outcome, well, you just mentioned 2000 is the relevant precedent here, not 2016, where the outcome really is in doubt. And this is the Gore-Bush election, where clearly there were voting irregularities that looked like they favored Republicans. Gore held out for a month after the election, waiting for the cases to wind their way through the court until the Supreme Court delivered an extraordinarily partisan 5-4 decision to stop the vote recount because they feared that if the vote recount went to conclusion, Gore, not Bush, would be declared the winner. And when that happened, when the Supreme Court delivered its ruling, Gore accepted it for the good of the Republic. The question is if something similar happens this time.
With this Supreme Court as well, just to add that into the mix.
With this Supreme Court and with Gore in the back of their minds, the Democrats will not accept that. And we have seen the threat of violence mostly on the right in American politics. But if a partisan Supreme Court is the institution that gives Trump an unjust win, all hell's got to break loose in America, because it will mean that not just has the MAGA movement lost confidence in democracy, but those voting for the Democratic Party have lost confidence in democracy as well. And that will put America in a situation where it has not been before.
See you on the Thursday after the Tuesday. As I mentioned there, I will next be talking to Gary on the Thursday after the election, which happens on a Tuesday, and we may or may not know the result then. A reminder that there is a bonus episode, another bonus episode, to go with our series with Shannon Valor on the history of thinking about thinking machines. It came out yesterday. It's on PPF Plus to sign up. Just click on the link in our show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. It is a conversation between me and Shannon about where we actually are now with AI, sorting out the science from the fiction, but also talking about the politics, including the politics of America and its relationship to AI. Also a reminder that we now have some merchandise available that you can get either through our website or through the LRB's website. We have an ethically sourced canvas tote bag. We have a bone china mug, both of them with the PPF logo. We think they look good, and we hope you might enjoy them. We're about to start a new series about great political films, but before that we have one more one-off episode. Next time, I'm going to be talking to the author, Michael Lewis, about his book, about the convicted financial fraudster, Sam Bankman-Fried, but also about the movement with which Sam Bankman-Fried has been associated, a movement in philosophy called effective altruism. What does that mean? That's next time. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.